Well, the trade numbers were a disaster. It's interesting too because these were the January numbers. And so January is when Donald Trump left office. And the January trades deficit in goods is an all-time record high. So this is the worst we've ever done on trade. So Trump turned over to Biden a much worse trade deficit than the one he inherited from Obama, despite the fact that that was a centerpiece of his campaign, was to turn around our trade imbalance. Instead, it got much, much worse. And the reason the trade deficit is so big is because the economy is actually so weak. Because what's happening is the government or the Federal Reserve is printing money and just giving it to unemployed people who aren't making stuff, but they're spending money. And so what they're doing is they're buying the stuff that people in other countries are employed making. So it's the productivity of the rest of the world that Americans are living off of. And the trade deficit evidences that and shows you that our whole economy, our whole recovery is a fraud.
So you mentioned between Trump and Biden, and Trump obviously attempted to reduce this deficit. What went wrong, or where was it misplaced? Well, what needs to be done in your opinion?
Well, that's because Trump never went to the root cause of the problem. He tried to cover up the symptoms with tariffs and renegotiating trade deals. But the reason for the lack of production is America's lack of competitiveness. And that comes because we have too much regulation, which really needed to be repealed. He did some of that, but not enough. But also because interest rates are artificially low, we don't save in America. And in order to manufacture stuff, you need capital equipment. And in order to have capital, you need investment, and that comes from savings, and we don't do it. And so the rest of the world is doing the saving and the capital investment, and we're living off that. So what Trump needed to do is cut government so that the Federal Reserve would stop stimulating the economy with cheap money so that we could start saving again. But we didn't do any of that. All Donald Trump did was encourage the Fed to blow more air into the bubble. And that is not a way to make the deficit smaller. That automatically makes them bigger, because the more dysfunctional our economy, the more production we need to rely on from the rest of the world.
You mentioned offline just before the interview that this trade deficit doesn't really get talked about anymore. And there are certain schools of thought that say, oh, trade deficit doesn't matter, this economy is built on consumer spending, etc. What do you say to that?
Well, they're wrong. I mean, it matters a lot, but it hasn't produced a crisis yet. So if that's your criteria for whether or not it matters, have we had a crisis? No, it hasn't happened yet, but a crisis is inevitable, because the accumulation of all these trade deficits is the problem, because America has enormous debts to the rest of the world. And we are basically selling out our country because we have all this debt, and the world is going to collect. Right? They're buying our assets, maybe their real estate, they're buying our stocks, but we have to service this debt. And it's going to be extremely hard to do that if interest rates rise. That's one of the reasons that there's a big panic right now with rising rates, because a lot of the bonds are held by foreigners because they own those bonds because they sold us stuff. We consume the stuff, so it's gone, but they still have the debt and we still have to pay for it. So these imbalances weigh heavily on an economy. We've already gone from the world's biggest creditor to the world's biggest debtor as a result of the accumulation of all these trade deficits. And so this really gives you a picture of how much America has declined. And at this point, we're just living off the charity of the rest of the world. And there's a limit to the amount of charity. And I think we're going to be testing those limits soon.
So what do you think beyond, raising interest rates, tapering back QE, I assume? Is this the only solution? Is this the root cause of what we're looking at?
Well, we need to shrink government. But the problem is, when we try to let interest rates go up, if the Fed tries to, taper, everything implodes, because the entire phony economy is built on that foundation of artificially low interest rates. So in order to go from a phony economy to a real economy, we have to let rates rise, but that means the phony economy collapses. But every time the phony economy starts collapsing, they feel that they have to prop it back up again. So they always interfere with the cure by making the economy sicker. And if they do that enough, eventually the economy dies of the disease. And that's exactly, I think, what's going to happen. And we'll see that in the form of a US dollar crisis and a sovereign debt crisis.
A couple of people asked me during the week, it seems like a pretty good environment for gold, right? Inflation fears, some equity market sell-off. Why do you think we haven't seen more action there?
Well, we have seen some action, mostly to the downside, and that's not what you would think. But I think the reason is the markets still believe that the Fed's got inflation under control. Even if they think they're behind the curve a bit, they believe that once it becomes more obvious to the Fed that inflation is a problem, they will quickly solve the problem using the tools that they claim to have, which would be raising interest rates. But what the markets seem to not understand yet is it's impossible for the Fed to do anything about inflation, and so they won't. Because from their perspective, the cure for inflation is worse than the disease of inflation. And so inflation is going to run out of control. That's what the markets don't get. The Fed is not going to fight inflation. The Fed is going to surrender to inflation without a fight. Inflation is going to win. And so anybody who has dollars is going to lose. And so people should be buying gold as fast as they can, not selling it. They just don't understand that yet, but eventually they'll figure it out.
Do you think, as people saying Chairman Powell might have to take emergency action before their next FOMC meeting, etc., you think he's in this position, or what's his next steps?
Well, unfortunately, the emergency action they're likely to take would be to expand the size of QE to try to artificially suppress long-term rates, because those rates are rising. The inflationary pressures are clearly building. Oil prices rose above $66 a barrel today. We're getting close to a 2-year high. We'll be at a 2-year high, I think, this month. I think we'll be at a 7-year high by the end of the year. I think we can easily be above $100 a barrel. And it's not just oil prices. The price of everything is going up. And it's not because we have a strong economy. We still have lots of Americans who are unemployed. Prices are going up because of all the inflation the Federal Reserve has created. Not just the inflation they created now, but the inflation they've been creating over the last 10 years. I mean, we're not even caught up yet with the inflation they created in the past, let alone the inflation of the present. So prices are going way, way up. And so interest rates are going way, way up unless the Fed artificially suppresses them, which they are going to do because nobody can afford to pay the market rate of interest that would happen if the Fed let the free market function. And so it's going to intervene. The question is, how much pain is the Fed going to allow before it does intervene? But when it intervenes to save the bond market and to save the economy and the stock market, it ends up killing the dollar because all the money it has to print in order to buy up all those bonds to keep rates from rising, now there's a glut of dollars. And so it has to sacrifice the dollar to save the bond market and the economy, but ultimately sacrificing the dollar means the economy and the bond market die too, because all bonds are promises to be repaid dollars. And if the dollar is destroyed and loses its value, then what good is a bond when all you're going to get repaid is dollars whose value has been destroyed?
Just incredible. It's been a long time coming. Peter, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.